in the going of our pastor to Hammond, Indiana, when I thought about that, I was thinking about the story of Nehemiah. You know, Nehemiah had a very cushy job. Let's continue to look here. Look at Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1 and 2. Let's read these two verses. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month Chislew, in the 20th year, I was in Shushan the palace, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. Okay, so here is Nehemiah, cupbearer to this Persian king. He's walking one day, and by the way, it's funny. It's a routine day for Nehemiah, and he's just going about his business, and he sees one of his Jewish brethren, Hananiah, and he knows that Hananiah had just recently returned from a trip to Jerusalem. So Nehemiah sees him, and he says, "Hey, how's things back home?" You know, that's the way we are. If you have somebody who goes back to where if you're not from California, and you know somebody who goes back to visit back where you came from, and when they come back from the trip, you always ask them, how's everything going? What's going on back there? Tell me about all the changes and all that kind of thing. So Nehemiah, on this one day, he bumps into this Jewish fella who just got back from Jerusalem, and he asks him, hey, what's going on back home? Tell me what's going on in Jerusalem. Tell me what's going on back in Israel. It turns out to be a turning point in Nehemiah's life. It was just an ordinary day. He bumps into this fella, asks him how's everything going, but right at that point, everything starts to change in Nehemiah's life. Now, it was just an ordinary day when Moses was out tending to his father-in-law's flock, when God came to him and spoke to him in a burning bush and told him that he was going to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. It was just an ordinary day when little David was out shepherding the sheep, and Samuel comes to his father's house. God told Samuel, go to Jesse's house. One of his sons is going to be the next king of Israel. You remember the story. Samuel the prophet comes to Jesse's house, and he sees this great, big, tall son of Jesse. And he thinks, wow, I wonder if this is going to be the new king. And God says, don't look upon his height or upon his stature. He says, God doesn't look on the outside. God looks on the heart. And so Samuel asked Jesse, bring in your boys here. I want to see. One of your boys is going to be the next king of Israel. And so they bring in the boys, and they come through, and Samuel's like, no, not him. Another one comes through. No, not him. Another one comes, no, not him. Finally, Samuel says to Jesse, he says, are these all your boys? Well, no, he says, I have this little young boy. He's out tending the sheep. Now, back in a Jewish family, the person who would be out tending the sheep was usually the youngest one in the family, because it's a dirty, nasty job. And the older boys, it's sort of like, who gets to haul the trash out at your house when it's time to take the trash out? Usually it's the youngest kid in the family, because all the older kids, I did my turn, I don't have to do that anymore. He can do it now, he's old enough. Well, here's little David. He's out tending the sheep, and all of a sudden they call him in, and Samuel says, that's the one. It was just an ordinary day for David. He was just out minding his own business, tending sheep, and God anoints him as the next king of Israel. It was just another ordinary day when Peter, Andrew, James, and John had come back from fishing all night. They were cleaning their nets, they were discouraged, they hadn't caught anything, and Jesus calls them to become fishers of men. So when we say it's just an ordinary day, there are no ordinary days. Every day is special. Every day that God gives you enough energy and life to wake up and put 2 feet on the floor and get about your business is a very special day. And we need to thank him for those kind of things. But Nehemiah just had what we would call a normal everyday day. Walks outside, bumps into this fellow, just got back from Jerusalem, asks him what's going on, and everything in Nehemiah's life changed at that moment. Look at verse 3. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Now, why would Nehemiah care about a group of Jews that lived hundreds of miles away from him? while he's got this cushy job as the cupbearer to the king in the palace? Why would he even, he already had a job. Nehemiah was okay. You realize if you're the cupbearer for the king, guess where you live? You live in the palace. Guess what kind of food you eat? You eat the food that the king eats. Guess what kind of clothes that you wear? If you're going to be the cupbearer of the king and you're going to be sitting right next to him at these estate dinners, he's going to have all kinds of special clothing for you. So here's Nehemiah. He's got this very cushy job in the palace under the Persian king. He hears about the Jewish people hundreds of miles away. He hears how that they went back there and they rebuilt the temple, but that the walls are destroyed, the people are in great affliction and reproach, and it touches Nehemiah's heart. It wasn't his fault that his ancestors sinned and got carried off into Babylonian captivity. Some of the people they didn't know what was going on. Some people prefer not to know what was going on. It would have been very easy for Nehemiah to not even care about what was going on in Jerusalem. He had a very busy job. He had a very important job. He was there in the palace, being the cupbearer to the king. But there's something in his heart that cared about home. He cared about his homeland. He cared about his people. And when he had heard from this fellow who just got back from a trip to Jerusalem, how that the walls of the city were all knocked down and were not rebuilt, he learned about the remnant of people that were there. He learned about the ruin of the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and he learned about the reproach of the city of Jerusalem. And that touched his heart. It really didn't affect him. It would not change anything in the normal course of his day, what went on in Jerusalem. But it touched his heart. After the Babylonian captivity, these 50,000 Jews went back there. They got the temple rebuilt, but the walls were down. Now, when a city's walls are not down, they're open for attack. One of the ways to guard a city is to build walls around the city and have gates. And at night, you close the gates and keep intruders from coming in on the city. Well, the city of Jerusalem didn't have the walls, and all the gates were burned when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed the city when he carried the Jews off into Babylonian captivity. So here's Nehemiah. He hears about what's going on in the city of Jerusalem, and it tugs at his heart. Didn't have to. Didn't bother him. And a lot of people have this attitude, well, hey, if it doesn't bother me, I'm not going to even worry about it. But it bothered Nehemiah because of the heart that he had for his people. Then look at verse 4. It came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat down and wept. And I mourned certain days and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Now Nehemiah cared enough that when he heard about the city of Jerusalem and the condition that it was in, that he wept and he fasted and he prayed. Sounds like somebody who really has a heart for his own people. It sounds like somebody who really has a heart that hurts when other people hurt. It doesn't sound like somebody who is living a cushy life in a very comfortable job with everything provided for him, everything of the best of things provided for him, and who doesn't care. That's not Nehemiah. Nehemiah is living a cushy job. Nehemiah does have a wonderful life, and everything is provided for him. But yet he has this heart that it was crushed when he heard about the people back in Jerusalem. When God puts a burden on your heart, don't try to escape it. Hold your place there in Nehemiah. I'm going to read to you a verse, Philippians chapter 2 and verse 13. This is talking about how God works in people's hearts. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 13 says, "For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure." God started working in Nehemiah's heart. When he heard about the walls, it bothered him. It bothered him so much that he cried. The Bible says he wept. It bothered him so much that he fasted. And he prayed for the people back home that the city might be rebuilt and that God would step in and help the people there. But Philippians 2:13 says, "It is God that worketh in you both to will and to do his good pleasure." Pastor Wilkerson told us, he said that he never wanted to go to Hammond, Indiana. He had no desire. He had planned to be here the rest of his life. I've told him many times over the 11 years that I've been here. I said, "Pastor, I hope you're my pastor the rest of my life. I said, he said, Brother Jerry, he said, I don't plan to go anywhere. He said, I'm going to live and die in Long Beach, California. He says, I'm happy here, and God's placed me here. But God can work in people's hearts and try to lead them in a direction that he wants them to go. Philippians 2:13 says, for it is God that worketh both in you to will and to do his good pleasure. It doesn't matter what I want to do. Back in February, our deacons require the pastor to have a evaluation meeting with every staff member once a year. And back in February, it was my time to have my evaluation with pastor. And when you go to have a staff evaluation, basically pastor says, how's everything going in what you do for the church? What do you have plans to do next year that you didn't do last year? Or is there something that the church can do, you think, that would help the ministry better? And so it's just basically a little time where we talk about goals and future things like that. And I remember in that meeting that I had with him, I told him, I said, Pastor, I want to answer a question for you that you probably would never ask me. He says, oh? I said, yes. I said, and this is back when my wife was just diagnosed with the cancer and started her chemotherapy and all that. And I told him, I said, Pastor, just in case you're wondering in the back of your mind, and I know you'd never ask me this, I said, but if this thing doesn't work out with her and she ends up going to heaven, I am not going to leave you. And I'm going to stay here at the church and continue to do my job. I said, God calls a person to do something, and then he places it within their heart to do that job. And I told him, I said, Pastor, I'm 60 years old. I said, I have never taken the steering wheel of my life into my own hands. I have never made decisions on my own. He says, because I was kind of wondering if maybe, if something happened to Gail where she didn't make it, if you'd go back to Louisiana and live where you have 2 children over there and 3 grandchildren, I was thinking, oh man, I wonder if he's going to go to Louisiana and to be there with his family, and because he lives 1,800 miles away. And he said, I'm so glad to hear that you said that. I said, I cannot do what I have not done in the past. Every time God has led me to go somewhere, he has clearly showed me. And I said, and as far as I'm concerned, if something happens with Gail and she doesn't make it through this thing, I said, that's not going to change the calling of God in my life. And so, but God works in people's hearts to do these kind of things. So Pastor Wilkerson said, I had no intentions of going to Hammond, Indiana, but God started working in his heart. And God started working in Nehemiah's heart. Nehemiah did not have to go to Jerusalem. Nehemiah did not have to leave that palace. He was fine where he was. But God started working in Nehemiah's heart. And he wept and he fasted and he prayed when he heard about the problems back in Jerusalem. It's customary for the Jews to sit down when they weep. And that's why it says in verse 4, it came to pass when I heard these words, I sat down and wept. Now, fasting to a Jew was only required 1 day a year. And that was on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would go inside the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle or in the temple and offer an offering for the sins of the people. That was the only time a Jew was required to fast. But here, Nehemiah, not requiring to do this, he decided to fast and pray for the people in Jerusalem when he heard about the bad news that had gone on there. And he thought to himself, somebody needs to do something. It's a very dangerous thing when you all of a sudden realize that there's a job that needs to be done and somebody needs to do it. Usually that means that God is placing something in your heart. When all of this legislation was coming down with the diesel buses in California, I was sitting in my office, this was October 2010, and I'm thinking, man, is anybody going to do anything about this? The churches are faced with having to get rid of all of our church buses because churches typically buy older buses. And I hadn't heard any kind of movement going on. I called Christian Law Association. I said, hey, are you folks working on anything with the diesel bus regulations in the state of California? And they said, well, no, we're aware of it, but no, we haven't done anything about it, And so I started calling some of these larger churches in California. I called up to Lancaster Baptist Church, I called up to North Valley Baptist Church, and I called a couple other churches, and I said, hey, are you guys doing anything about this diesel bus regulations? And everywhere I called, the answer was the same, no. So all of a sudden, God's like, Hey, why don't you do something about it? And I'm thinking, no, not me. I said, Lord, somebody needs to do something about this. Well, a lot of times when God places something on your heart and he hasn't placed it on anybody else's heart to do, guess what? You might be the one that has to do it. And so that's how I got involved in this. I had no intentions of flying to Sacramento and all the different times that I did, going in meetings with these legislators in their offices, going to Sacramento, testifying in these hearings. I have no intentions whatsoever of doing it. I called Dr. Gibbs and said, look, why don't you guys take over this thing and all that? He said, well, it'd be better if somebody who lives in California does it, because that's who it is affecting. He says, yeah, we'll help you in anything you need help with. He said, but somebody in the state of California needs to be the one to do this. Here's Nehemiah, sitting in the palace, cupbearer to the king, cushy life, everything provided for him. He hears about the trouble in Jerusalem. Boom, it hits him in his heart. He starts crying. He starts fasting. He starts praying. You do those three things, you better watch out. God might be tapping you on the shoulder to do something. And that's what happened here with Nehemiah. So Nehemiah prays. Look at verse 5. So here's Nehemiah's prayer. And said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments, thine ear now be attentive and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayers of thy servant, which I pray thee now day and night for the children of Israel, thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments which thou commandest my servant Moses. Remember, I beseech thee, the words that thou commandest my servant Moses, saying, if ye transgress, I will scatter you abroad amongst the nations. But if you turn unto me, and keep my commandments, and do them, though there were of you cast out to the uttermost parts of heaven, yet will I gather them from thence, and will bring them unto the place that I have chosen to set my name there. Now these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power and by thy strong hand. So here's Nehemiah's prayer. And he prays to God to help the children of Israel, help them in their difficulties. And he admits the fact that they did wrong. He said, I and my people have sinned. That's what caused them to get carried off into captivity to begin with. That's what caused the temple to be destroyed. That's what caused the city of Jerusalem to be destroyed and all the walls torn down and all the gates burned with fire and the city be in an uproar. Was because the children of Israel sinned against the Lord and the Lord was punishing them. So now Nehemiah realizes that the people are back, but the walls aren't built and the gates are torn down and the city's unfortified and everything's a mess. And as Nehemiah prays, God starts working on Nehemiah's heart. He had no intentions of doing this, but remember Philippians 2:13 says, for it is God that worketh in you, first both to will, he works in you to want to do something, and to do his good pleasure. And that's the way God works. It starts in the heart. Somebody said, I can't remember who said this, every great work begins with the burden of a man. Somebody gets a burden to do something. This church was started in 1894 in Long Beach, California. Why? Because a man named J.C. Allaire came to Long Beach. This was before the city of Long Beach was even incorporated as a city. In fact, it was just a village. When he arrived in Long Beach in 1893, there were only 654 people that lived in this town. He found only 6 other Baptist people in the town. He got concerned. He invited those 6 people over to his home to have a prayer meeting. And they started to pray that God would start a church in Long Beach for the Baptist people. And little did he realize, though, that that burden that God placed upon him to go find those 6 Baptist people and round them up and invite them to come to his home and have a prayer meeting. I don't think J.C. Allaire woke up one day and said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start a church today. No, that's not how it happened. God placed a burden on this man's heart because there was no church in this village, because he did find 6 other Baptist people here. And he decided just to call them into his home and said, folks, hey, there's no church here for us to attend. Let's start praying and see what God will do. And little did he realize that on May 20th, 1894, that 15 people signed a charter, a piece of paper, and began the First Baptist Church of Long Beach, California. I always tell people the name of our church describes who we are. We actually are the First Baptist Church in Long Beach, California, back in 1894 when the church was started. But it didn't start out with this master genius plan of some man. Mr. Allaire didn't come to Long Beach and scout out a piece of property and go talk to the village people and try to find out where he can buy a piece of land so he could start a church. No, he came to Long Beach, and it started with a burden in his heart. Nehemiah had this nice cushy job in the Persian palace as the cupbearer to the king. It's the burden of going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the walls and rebuilding the gates of the city of Jerusalem. It started as a burden in his heart. He had no intentions of going there. All he was inquiring of a friend how things are going back over there. In the palace, he had comfort. When he went over to build the walls in Jerusalem, he had a lot of rigorous activity to do. In the palace, there was security. When he went back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, there was danger. The fact that there was no walls around the city meant that anybody could come and intrude the city and do whatever they wanted to. In the palace, he had luxury. He had all the finest things of life. When he went back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem, the place was in ruin. There was nothing beautiful about it. There was nothing fancy and nothing provided for him. In the palace, he had prestige. He was the cupbearer to the king. Well, when he went to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, he was ridiculed. The people who were the Jewish enemies came and tried to thwart the work and tried to stop the work of rebuilding the wall. Whereas in the palace, he had a prestigious position and everybody who knew who he was, and they talked nicely to him. They treated him very well. But when he went to go rebuild those walls, he was ridiculed, he was criticized, and he had a lot of threats made against him. In the palace, he had fine food. When he was in Jerusalem building those walls, they just had bare necessities. They just had the food that they needed to eat in order to give their bodies strength so that they could keep working. In the palace, he had it made. He had it at ease. He probably didn't have any calluses on his hand. Hey, he was a cupbearer to the king. What was his job? He went with the king. He tasted the drink. He tasted some of the food to make sure the king wasn't going to get poisoned. Now, all of a sudden, he's in Jerusalem. And the walls and the rubble and the stones and all that it took I'm sure that he had blisters and calluses on his hands by the time he got done building the walls of the city of Jerusalem. But that's not what he had back in the palace. So not realizing what was going on, he had to look at chapter 2. Look at verse 11 in chapter 1. Let's read the last verse in chapter 1. So here, Nehemiah is praying. God's working in his heart, putting a burden in his heart. And he says, O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants who desire to fear thy name. Prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. All of a sudden, God placed it in Nehemiah's heart to go and talk to the king and to see if he could go and help rebuild those walls. Remember, there was nothing for him to profit by making this move. As a matter of fact, he had a lot of things to lose. In looking at this position that Pastor Wilkerson is taking, there's nothing to gain in it. Just in case you ever hear somebody criticizing, say, oh, Pastor Wilkerson's going to take that big church in Hammond, Indiana. Oh, a great big church like that, they probably have a great big salary and all. The salary is the same that he has here. Oh, he's going to that great big church in Hammond because there's a lot of prestige in being the pastor of a church. Do you realize the auditorium in Hammond, Indiana is 5 times the size of this building? This building holds about 1,500 people. Their auditorium seats 7,500. They'll probably have maybe 10,000 people there today for Sunday school and church. They operate over 100 buses all over the city of Chicago and Hammond, Indiana, and all that. So before you stop and think, and I'm thinking about Nehemiah, and this is what brought me to this lesson today. I'm thinking about the parallels between Nehemiah and what our pastor's going through. They're $22 million in debt. Guess who's in charge of the finances of a church? Guess who's responsible to have to get on his knees and beg? When Pastor Wilkerson became the pastor of this church, we were $922,000 in debt. And that was a massive amount for a church our size. Now he's going to a church that's $22 million in debt. He's going to a church that they haven't had a pastor for 5 months. He's going to be walking into something that is going to be complete. If you've ever prayed for Pastor Wilkerson, you need to pray for him all the more at this point in his life. Just like Nehemiah. There was nothing for Nehemiah to gain to go to Jerusalem and help rebuild those walls. He was fine where he was. He had a very important job. He was successful in what he did. The king trusted him. He was the cupbearer. He had prestige. People talked nicely to him. People took care of him. All of his needs were met, and as far as he was concerned, life was going on just fine. And I'm thinking, I'm just talking to him. If this is being recorded, please don't record it, okay? I'm just talking to you folks from my heart to you, okay? There is nothing, humanly speaking, that would want a person. Here is our church. We paid off the $1 million, the $922,000 or whatever it is, okay? So we don't have any debt. The church is growing. They had one bus. When I came here, we got 15 buses. They had 58 missionaries when Pastor Wilkerson came here. Now we got over 400, and I don't even know how many we have now, 470 or whatever it is, missionaries, okay? We have made major improvements on these buildings and on this property. What would be the easier thing for Pastor Wilkerson to do right now? Would it be to stay here in Long Beach, now that we have all of our debt paid, and now maybe we could look off into the future, and maybe we could start other churches around the area like he's had it, in his mind that he would like to do? Wouldn't it be easier for him to stay in Long Beach with a church that's completely out of debt? Wouldn't it be easier for him to stay in the church here in Long Beach where the people love him to death? Wouldn't it be easier for him to stay here where he knows what's going on? There's no surprises here. Or would it be to go to this gigantic church with $22 million in debt? They've laid off 125 employees over the last 2 years because trying to struggle with the finances. I mean, humanly speaking, there would be nothing that Nehemiah would want to leave a job in the palace of the king, having everything provided for him, to go to Jerusalem and to labor with his hands, building the walls of the city of Jerusalem, with people ridiculing him and harassing him, and he had to get workers together and try to get this job done. What would be the easy thing to do? Well, the easiest thing for Nehemiah to do would be just to stay in the palace and say, "Oh, Lord, please send somebody over there to help those poor people." But God instead placed it in Nehemiah's heart to go do this. And God strengthened Nehemiah. Do you know a cupbearer to the king does not know how to build anything in most cases? A cupbearer to the king, how does he know how to build a wall? How does he know how to deal with masonry? How does he know how to mix mortar? How does he know how to lay brick and rock and build a wall? How does he know how to round up some carpenters and build wooden gates for the city? He doesn't know that kind of stuff. But when God calls a man to do something, he equips them. There's an old quote that says, God does not call an equipped man to do a job. He calls a man to do a job and then he equips him. And that's what happened here in Nehemiah. Let's continue reading, chapter 2. It came to pass in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of Artaxerxes the king, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and I gave it to the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. By the way, you never go in the front of a king with a sad face. The king lived this life of luxury. Everything was provided. He had beautiful flowers when he came to eat. He had beautiful music by minstrels playing in the background. You never came to the king with a sad story. You never came to the king with the mully grubs on your face. You never came to the king. Everything for the king was supposed to be nice and calm and soothing. But here comes Nehemiah. He goes before the king and he's sad. Verse 2, wherefore the king said unto him, why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid. Then said the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchre, lieth in waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Nehemiah said, King, I'm sorry. The reason I'm sad is my homeland is a mess. The city doesn't have walls, and the gates are burned. Verse 4, the king said unto me, for what dost thou make thy request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. The king says, well, what do you want to do? And right away, Nehemiah is praying. He makes one of those really quick prayers. The king says, what do you want? And before he answers the king, Lord, help me when I answer this. And then look at verse 5. And I said to the king, if it please the king, if thy servant found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me to Judah, the city of my father's sepulchre, that I may build it. And the king said unto me, the queen also sitting by him, for how long will thy journey be, and whence wilt thou return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. I don't have time to finish the rest of the story, but you can read it yourself. Nehemiah does go to Jerusalem. Nehemiah leaves that cushy job at the palace. Nehemiah leaves a life of ease, of comfort, a life of security, a life of really not worrying about the future. As far as he's concerned, everything's going to be fine. He's living in the palace. But God placed it upon his heart to go and do a work for him. God placed it upon Nehemiah's heart to go and do something that's difficult. God placed it upon Nehemiah's heart to leave his familiar surroundings, leave the job that he has, leave what you would call comforts, and move and go and perform a work for him. And the miracle is Nehemiah did that, and God did equip him, and God did help him, and God did give him the brains how to build the walls, and God did give him the workers how to build the walls, and 52 days they built the walls around the city of Jerusalem. But it all started with a burden in his heart, and something he couldn't get away from. It wasn't something he planned. It wasn't something necessarily he wanted to do. It wasn't something that, humanly speaking, would be a desirable thing to do. But when God places something in a man's heart to do it, he has one of two choices. You can either follow God's will and do his bidding, or you can go against God's will, but then you take it all in your own hands. I told Pastor, I said, if I had stayed when I was living in Louisiana before I came here, I've told you this story many times, but I just want to illustrate something to you. My house was paid for in Louisiana. I lived on almost an acre of land. I had a little pond in the back of my house. I had no property tax. I lived out in the country. I was almost 50 years old. I was at the point of life where everybody would like to be. You're getting close to your retirement years. The house is paid for. You don't have all the kids that are at home anymore. You don't have all those financial burdens. I was working at the bus company in New Orleans. They offered to double my salary if I would stay. I was in Warren Johnson's church, a brand new startup church in Baton Rouge. I was teaching Sunday school in the auditorium just like I do here. There would be every reason for me not to leave Louisiana. I had a good job. I was in Brother Warren Johnson's church, and everything was going my way. And here's John Wilkerson calling me on the phone to come to Long Beach, California. And at first I resisted, but God started working in my heart. And I told Pastor, I said, do you realize if I would have stayed in Louisiana because of all the things that I would look at as reasons to stay, I said, none of those reasons exist today. When Katrina went through New Orleans in 2005, it wiped out that bus company, and that bus company is no longer in existence today. Warren Johnson has recently taken a church in the Dallas, Texas area. That's where Pastor's preaching today at the missions conference. So the very reasons why I would have wanted to stay in Louisiana, because I had this good job at the bus company, and because I was in Brother Warren Johnson's church, and I was helping him, it was a new church, startup church. If I'd have stayed in Louisiana, all those things would be gone today. And I would have looked back and said, ooh, I wonder if I should have gone to California and followed God's will for my life. So you see, folks, when people make decisions like Pastor made, it isn't because they want to do it. It isn't because they sat back in a master plan, oh, one day I'm going to leave this church and go to a bigger church. The salary is the same. The problems are enormous. The number of staff there is incredible. The people that he's going to have to, here he knows everybody, here everybody knows him, he knows everybody. He's going to go over there and he's going to have to learn the people, and the people are going to have to learn him. He's going to have to face that $22 million in debt. He's going to have to face all these things. Pray for him. And don't think that, oh, he's just taking this big church because it's going to be a prestigious thing to do. No, it's not. It's not. So we need to pray for him. We need to pray for God to give him wisdom. We need to pray for God to give him blessing. But as I was thinking about him and I thought about the story of Nehemiah, I said, wow, what a parallel. Nehemiah didn't need to do that. Nehemiah didn't have to do that. But Nehemiah did know one thing. God placed it in his heart, and he wanted to follow God. Ladies and gentlemen, if we have the opportunity to do our choice or God's choice, you better do what God says, because he's a whole lot smarter than you and I. And he knows the future, and he knows the end from the beginning. So pray for our pastor. It's going to be sad. We're going to miss him. Of course we're going to miss him. But we have to understand, he would never just pull up and leave on his own. He would never just make a decision like this, oh, I'm going to go take this bigger church. No, God placed it in his heart. I'm sure it's tearing him up to have to leave. This is the first church he's ever pastored. He loves us dearly. We love him. But continue to pray for him, pray for his family. And even after he leaves, pray that God would help him in that gigantic ministry that he's going to be going to, that's plagued with a lot of problems and a lot of things. And we're just going to love him, continue to pray for him, and especially now, we have him for the next few weeks. When he gets back in town, write him a note. Tell him all that you thank him for. And this whole Sunday school lesson is not just to pump up Pastor Wilkerson, but I want you to understand that sometimes God works in people's hearts to do something that is kind of hard, to do something out of their normal bounds of reason, to do something that necessarily doesn't make sense, but it's the will of God. When I came to California, there was no guarantee of anything here. The church was in doom and gloom, but yet it was God's will, and we followed God's will. I look back on it now, I'm so thankful. I'm thankful that I listened to God. I'm thankful I didn't stay in Louisiana. And one day you'll look back on your life and you'll thank God for following his will.